Alvin Holmes.
Okay, everybody.
Who was about, this was about, I don't know, about 30 years ago, basically, and he was the only person teaching classical architecture in North America, I think, at that time. And I was motivated by trying to find some rationalistic basis for design. I've always kind of had that thing. And in doing so, I eventually got to reading an ancient Roman architect named Vitruvius from the 1st century BC. And Vitruvius gives you some methods for designing, and the method turns out to be a numerical method. Right? And so instead of, I was trained in modern architecture, of course, and you get told, you get asked, how do you feel about architecture, how do you feel about design, how do you feel about the problem, and you have to, your goal is to create something that's never been seen before. And if you've never been...
Can I ask you to speak up because you're in competition with music?
Can they turn it down?
Yeah, there's some mic.
We have the mic there. You might have to turn on the, it should be on, actually.
That would be great.
There we go. All right, so can you hear?
Yeah.
That's better.
Can we hear now? Okay, I began to study the classical system of architecture in a search for some kind of rational basis for design, which I've always been interested in trying to find. And I eventually read some work, a famous work by an ancient Roman architect named Vitruvius. And in Vitruvius, he gives you a method of design, but it's not a method, not a modern method of design. It doesn't deal with how you feel, or it doesn't deal with your own personal state of mind in any way. It basically was a system of numbers. It was kind of number specification. And I was kind of shocked at first, but then I just took out a drawing board. I took out my drawing board and I drew what he said. I just drew the numbers that he gave. And in about 10 minutes, I had produced a classical portico that was just, you know, it was a real thing. It looked like a classical portico, and I didn't have to. It wasn't about how I felt, or it was not subjective. So I began to find my rational basis. But Vitruvius doesn't go all the way. Vitruvius only takes you about 90% of the way to actual design. And so I began to search. One of the things that he tells you in the section on design is that the system he's giving you is associated with Plato, Pythagoras, and an individual that he calls Hermogenes, who actually was an architect in the Hellenistic period. But of course, Hermogenes means born of Hermes. So it's a kind of tip-off whether the guy, and that probably was not his real name, but if he did exist, but it's a tip-off that the system that he's giving you is a Hermetic system, or is coming out of the wisdom tradition that's associated with Egypt, as Hermes grows out of gold in Egypt. So that was the. So then I knew I had to first of all finish the study of classical architecture, and then I also had to begin to delve into Plato and Pythagoras in a more serious way than I had ever before. I had a little exposure in college where they basically told me Plato was a fascist and he'd have guys get arrested and thrown out of town. So that was the end of that. Then we studied Aristotle for the rest of the term. But you know, they say in the spiritual world, they say if you seek, you'll find, or if you ask, you'll be answered. And so first I found this fellow Alvin Holmes, who was the only person at that time who was actually teaching classical architecture anywhere in the country, or anywhere in North America, I think, or other, maybe even wider afield. And so I went and studied with him for a couple of terms, and he taught me the rest of the system. He actually taught me how to implement the system. And then I found, in the study of Platonism, I knew that I couldn't go to a regular college and take a regular CE course because it wouldn't amount to anything. But I found, in my looking around, I found Keith Critchlow, who is a brilliant artist in his own right, and was a teacher, and a very deep student of Neoplatonism. And he's coming out of a Christian, out of a Christian Neoplatonist tradition. So between the two of these guys, I studied Alvin, and when you study with Alvin, he takes you through the numbering system. And then with Keith Critchlow, Keith took me through the Timaeus line by line, and there, of course, were the same numbers that I was finding in Vitruvius. Right? And that you find also in the Renaissance architects as well, because they also studied Vitruvius and others. So I asked and I was answered, and so what you're going to see in a certain sense here, any work that I present, is a synthesis of these guys, and they're both still around, and they can be contacted. So the second point that I want to make here before I started is that what I'm going to be showing here is really going to pick up on particularly the presentation by Scott yesterday, who was also a student of Keith and knows Alvin as well, right? And so what I'm going to be doing is kind of an applied version of what he was talking about. And you'll see some of the same ideas. There is one point that I would make, maybe for Scott's benefit or for other people who saw that talk. One of the things about what's called sacred geometry, and I'm not very comfortable really with that term, I call it philosophical or symbolic geometry. Sacred geometry, according to Keith anyway, Keith told me that, he said sacred geometry has to be tied to a sacred tradition. So you don't just do sacred geometry, as they say, Stamm der Weltlein, standing alone in the world. It has to be tied to something. And since I'm not really tied to any of the major religious traditions in my own life, I don't teach sacred geometry, I teach philosophical or symbolic geometry. So it's a little bit different. But one of the things is that it's a kind of open-ended field, and people approach it individually. There really is no school where you can go to get a degree in this. And so everybody uses, in a certain sense, their own terminology. They use slightly different terminology. Now, Scott has, because of the kind of subjects that he presents and the people he presents to, has divided, or speaks about phi in terms of a greater and a lesser. And he has, what do you call it, big phi and baby phi? Or,
yep. Big phi and little phi.
Big phi and little phi, okay. But just to make life interesting, I don't actually use the terminology because I speak to a different audience. I don't speak to a philosophical audience or a general audience like that. I speak to an architectural or art audience. And so in the attempt to keep this thing concise and not confuse people, I use phi as 0.618, which is what Scott calls little phi, little phi. Right? So when I say phi, it's his phi.
I see.
It's phi and phi here. So just to try to avoid some confusion, because it can be a little confusing. So that's the other thing, and as I say, I'm going to be applying some of the things that he said. Now, Jonas asked me to talk about Egypt. I'm not a particular expert on Egypt. I actually know more about some later stuff than I do about Egypt. But what I did was take some small fragments, and these are what I'm going to be presenting is not even the tip of an iceberg. I mean, Egypt is incredibly vast. I think that maybe Kathleen just mentioned that it ran for nearly 3,000 years. I mean, it goes dynastic in about 2700 BC, and it doesn't end until the 3rd or 4th century AD. So figure that out. It's 3,100 years, right? That's like 12 times the history of the United States. Right? 12 times, right? And Egypt was ancient when Plato went there. Egypt was older. When Plato went there, Egypt was older than Rome is for us.
Oh,
that's the scale of what we're looking at. And so Egypt is an enormous spectacle. It's a fantastic panoply. They had a lot of time, and they didn't have any real neighbors for a long time. They were alone, you know. And so they developed things on their own. And so Egyptian spirituality is a huge spectacle of layer upon layer upon layer. Every section of the Nile was called a nome and had its own mythology, had grown up independently. Every city had their own divinities, right? And when the dynastic people took over, they imposed their own views, yes, in the capitals, but they did not destroy the older systems. They just kind of left them there and sort of picked and chose as time went on. And as the capital shifted and the dynasties shifted, different gods came to the fore, and the same god was called something else or merged with other gods. So these systems are incredibly complex. There's no possible way that I can do justice to it in a single talk. Nobody can do justice to it in a single talk. So what I'm going to be showing here is not just the tip of an iceberg, right? But it's just a few chips off the tip of the iceberg, right? And I was trying to be selective and only show things that had architectural implications. So I'm not trying to really cover Egyptian philosophy or Egyptian religion. That's really not even possible in a single talk. Maybe it is for somebody, but not for me. So we're just looking at fragments of the tip, so to speak, that show up architecturally. And as an architect, I have a penchant for starting with the floor plan, you know. Right? So here's the floor plan. Right? And I also enjoy this kind of thing. This, as you can see up in the two corners here, the space station, I think, where they took the picture from. And I enjoy these because I consider them to be Aquarian viewpoints, right? Where some people say we've already entered the age of Aquarius. Some people say it's got a couple hundred more years to go. It depends on how you divide the zodiac, right? If you divide it in equal increments of 12, then we've already entered the age of Aquarius. However, if you divide it by the constellations themselves, Pisces happens to be a rather large constellation, and we won't actually enter it until 2200 AD. So we got another almost 200 years to go. So it depends on how you look at it. But the thing about the Piscean age, see, in the age of Taurus, which was, I think, 4000 to 2000 BC, the institution of the farm and the farm's relationship to the city was developed, right? The earth sign developed the farming, and you can't have cities without farming. You can't have civilization. Civilization means life in the city. And the city can't exist without the farm. So this comes about in the age of Taurus. Then it shifts, I believe, it shifts into Aries, right? The next constellation is Aries. And Aries is the fire sign. And in the fire sign, the great empires were built, right? All the great ancient empires. Egypt, Mesopotamia, India, China, Greece, Rome, all of these things that came up, they're all Aryan, right? Ruled by fire. And the fire, of course, is what you need to make iron. So the iron is what you chop people up with, so that's how, so it's Aryan. We then, at the time in the year 1, there was no year 0, by the way, but in the year 1 we essentially entered the Piscean age, right? And Christianity is a Piscean religion. Christ is surrounded by water symbols and fish symbols and fishermen, and all. He feeds people with the fish, and it's all fish. And they use the Vesica. The Vesica Pisces was the sign which Christians used to meet and all that stuff. So it's all water stuff. And in that era, civilization went worldwide, right? And it went horizontally across the surface of the earth, across the waters, right? Britain, the final empire, really, or maybe with the final empire, but the British Empire anyway was an ocean empire. It was a Piscean empire, right? Very much so. And Christianity is a Piscean religion, and so is modern Judaism, to my mind. But now we're entering the Aquarian period, and that's an air sign. And so humanity is going now three-dimensional. We're now leaving the plane of the Earth. And the photographs, to me, symbolize this. The great photograph of the guys going around the moon, right? And the Earth is this little thing up here, and the moon is this giant thing right in the front. That's the Aquarian image, right? And it's an image of my time, and I kind of associate with it. So I always start with these kind of pictures. So here we are. Here's the floor plan of Egypt. This is the southern part of it down here. And this is the Nile, the Valley of the Nile. It's just a strip. And here's the Delta, okay? The Sinai, the canal, and so on. So this is Egypt. This is what we're going to be looking at. So again, let's see if this will go this way. Okay. So metaphysics, right? This is a conference on metaphysics. Now, what is metaphysics? There are many definitions, right? Like a lot of these things, there are many definitions. And I'm defining it here as a set of permanent, unchanging ideas that underlie and inform the physical world of multiplicity that we see around us, right, that we experience. And in the Platonic idea, or in the Platonic system, the closest we can get to those principles is number. Right? And it's not mathematics exactly, because that's our view of mathematics is kind of reduced in this age, and it's strictly reduced to logic. But number goes beyond mere mathematics. Number is a more general principle. It's an expression. It's a principle of expression. And the two guys, two of my favorite beings, as it were, from ancient Egypt, are Ptah here and Thoth. Now, Ptah is I don't actually know that much about Ptah. We see him standing here. He's fused with this this thing called the Jed column, here, and he's almost an outgrowth of the Jed, and he's wrapped. You can't tell from this drawing, but he's wrapped as a mummy, right? And his hands, he's able to extend his hands, but he can't move anything else, really. He's rigid, and he's restricted in his movements, right? Now he's the Greek Hephaestus, and Hephaestus also was restricted in his movements. What did I do? Did I switch it off? Yeah. Hephaestus was also restricted in his movements because he was crippled, and I won't go into the whole myth of how he got crippled, but he's restricted in movement, just like Ptah, right? And he's also a god associated with coming into form, right? Making things. He's a god associated with making things, and he's the patron of the artisans. Now I've added the architects, but he's mostly artisans, and he's associated with metalwork. The interesting thing about Hephaestus for me is that he's crippled, and he's funny looking. He's not a good looking guy, and, but he's got real big arms. You know, he's got those big old arms, right? If you ever shake hands with a real builder, a serious builder, he's got big hands. These guys have big hands, and they've got big arms, you know. And it's just like Hephaestus, you know. And the joke, of course, is that he's married in an arranged marriage. Needless to say, he's married to Aphrodite, right? The goddess of beauty. This is a setup between Hera, who doesn't like him, and set him up. See, he did it deliberately, of course. And so Aphrodite's job is to make love. That is her job. That's her sacred job, right? And she does everybody. The whole mythological Greek world and all the families claim that they were descended from her, right? She did everybody. There's only one guy that she won't do. Guess who, right? She won't do Hephaestus, right? Her regular boyfriend is Ares or Mars. And the planets actually conjunct in the sky once every 13 months. Because they have cycles, as Scott pointed out in his talk. He showed those slides. Did you show the slide? That great slide, right? Where Venus makes 5 retrograde loops in 8 years. So there you have it, right? She shows you the golden section. She dances out the golden section in the sky, right? Fantastic. And her regular boyfriend is Mars, who she meets with every 13 months in the sky. And I followed them for a while, and they did indeed meet. And so Hephaestus finally gets driven around the bend, but he's frustrated by this, and he's driven around the bend, and he creates the net. Did you mention the net and the alchemy of the net?
I don't think I mentioned it, but
iron and copper, something.
you know
Somebody
that's
mentioned
been
it.
duplicated in the alchemical labs.
Okay.
They duplicated that experiment.
Okay, but you know, he's iron and she's copper, right? That's basically the idea. And it's interesting because the planet Mars is red, you know, covered with iron oxide. How do they know, right? So, and Venus is copper colored, you know. So he goes around the bend and he creates a net, and he tricks them into going to bed together. He tells her he's going to be out of town for a while. So she immediately calls Ares, and they get together, and he throws a net over them while they're in bed and making love. And he calls all the other gods to say, "Look, you see, I'm not crazy. You know, this is what's going on." Right? The gods are hilarious, and they're cracking up, and Zeus is disgusted and everything. So, but the thing for me, the analogy for me as a person who makes things, or who has wanted to make things his whole life, from the very beginning, Julianne unfortunately is not here today, but that's the story. I mean, I knew from the time I was 9. I heard the word architect for the first time when I was 9. There's never been a day in my life that I didn't know who I was after that. And most people can't say that. So that's the daemon. See, there's a daemon who's calling me to do that. I don't know exactly who it is. So it's supposed to be Hermes. My astrologer said it was Hermes. So I'm still, of course, it's Hermes. So anyway, the metaphor is that the artisan is married to the beautiful, but cannot possess it. Right? Because beauty is a thing in itself. Beauty is a force in itself, and cannot be owned or possessed. You can approach it. You can chase it, right? You can pursue it, and you can. Maybe other people will judge that you get there, right? But you're always going to be frustrated as a pursuer of it, because you're never going to be able to own it or control it, right? And it's a nice metaphor. So that's Ptah, and the other guy here is Thoth, of course, and Thoth is associated with higher wisdom and with magic. He's the inventor of writing, which is kind of a form of magic, really, if you think about it. And since letters were numbers in the ancient world, although the Egyptians had their own sort of script, but letters were numbers, so letters, rather numbers are a form of magic, really. They have a magical aspect. And he's the Greek Hermes. And Hermes, as I say, I was told was my daemon, so I'm kind of stuck on those two guys. Now, again, I like to start at the beginning of things and about creation. So my whole thing is about creation. Now, forgive the amount of text. You know, there was a famous rhetorician, I think it could have been Cicero, I'm not sure, who said that if you want me to talk for an hour, I can start now. If you want me to talk for 5 minutes, I have to go home and rehearse. Because editing takes time. Like blabbing, you can just do. Right? But editing takes time. So because of the haste in which these presentations are done, it's hard to edit them. So there's a lot of verbiage here. But basically, the Egyptian creation story is an incredible story. Actually, there were scores of stories. I mean, the one that I'm presenting here is what's called the Heliopolitan story. It was the big imperial story through most of Egyptian history, so it's the best known. But the story begins with primal chaos, as depicted as water, as a kind of water that's known as the Nun, right? And it has no light, it has no form. It's what the Greeks called chaos, the primal chaos, and within this primal chaos, there is a potential. There's a kind of vibratory potential that's illustrated by the serpent here, right? This serpentine potential. And the serpentine potential causes a bubble to form in the Nun, right? So a sphere forms in the Nun in which the orderly cosmos will take place, right? And the chaos is still out there somewhere, you know, beyond our physical universe. Atum, this being called Atum, who's the first divinity, rises in personified form into this bubble. And he's standing on a mound, right? Now in Egypt, of course, the river used to flood every year. It doesn't anymore, which is going to be a big problem for these guys after the dam, you know, goes in another 50 years or whatever. They'll probably try to build another one, but the whole country has been changed by this. They now do things that they couldn't never do before for thousands of years because the Nile doesn't flood anymore. So they could live where they couldn't live, they can grow where they couldn't grow, and so on. They're going to get wasted by this when that dam goes.
Where's it going?
Where's
it going? When you say when it goes, where is it going?
Well, it's probably, what is it, about 40 years old now, or 50 years old? What is the lifespan of these things? Maybe it's 100 years, I don't know. No, I mean, it silts up, you know, and the concrete cracks. You know, reinforced concrete, as a modern material, it has a relatively short lifespan. You know, brick and stone have very long lifespans because they have very low coefficients of expansion. But reinforced concrete has steel in it, right? So the concrete has a low coefficient of expansion, but the steel has a very high coefficient of expansion, which means it's moving more than the concrete every day. And so every day it breaks itself away just a little bit. This is all over the world. I mean, every reinforced concrete thing you've ever seen is going to last maybe 100 years, and you're going to have to tear it down. Okay. All right. So enough about the dam, but
I wanted to know that.
Not really our subject. But what happens is Atum, as a personified being here, rises on a mound. See, the primeval mounds. And the mounds are depicted in this way in the hieroglyphs. Here's the most obvious form. But then they also have these things with battered sides. And this symbol here is a platform symbol. I think it was you, Gary, who was pointing out that the people in the tarot stand on a platform, or what did you call it?
They sit on a throne that's on top of a platform.
Okay, the platform. Well, these are the platforms, right, from ancient Egypt. And Atum is alone, right? And okay, from the surface there emerges the mound. Okay, let's continue as far as we can. Now, here's a late representation of the mound. This is called a pyramidion. It was actually the top of a pyramid, but it's also in the shape of the primal stone, or it's a refinement of the primal mound, which was called the benben. And you see it here in this illustration. Here's the mound. The mound is on a support shaft or a column, and this bird called the phoenix, which means light, it's a bird, it's a fiery bird, lands on it, right? And in this illustration, this is an odd illustration. It's the only one I can find, really, or almost the only one I can find. This thing called called the benben. Actually, the whole thing is the benben, but this is the pyramidion. And there's another illustration in the next slide, I think, where the bird is actually sitting on this. rather than on this special stand that he's got. But the phoenix is the light, and the light is the first day, and this is sort of, and you know, the Hebrew tradition came out of Egypt, for my money, rather than Mesopotamia. They say they came out of Mesopotamia, but that was a gift to their overlords at that time when they wrote the book. So they actually came out of Egypt, I think. And so their story is very much the same. You know, and I think in the Kabbalistic story, there's also a bubble that forms in the chaos. Beam of light. Okay.
It's called a zim.
Okay, well, it's in the ray,
But
right?
basically
It's the ray of light.
Zim,
Yeah,
zim.
so this is the ray, the bird represents here the ray of light.
The
It's
Dr.
basically the same
Seuss
story with different
philosophy
images.
of the
So the
creation.
bird sits on top of the
Zim, just
mound,
saying the word.
and the
Then
mound
zim,
gets
zim.
refined
Zim,
into this, and the bird is the light source, and these are the projecting rays of the light as it descends. Right? The light projects as it comes down to the earth, and it's the crystallized. It's sometimes called the crystallized seed of Atum. And Atum, let's see, is it in this one? The god rising on the mount. Okay, the appearance. Right, the phoenix is the sun, the pyramid on which it perches, the rays emanate. Okay, and this thing here later gets refined into the obelisk, which is just a pedestal for the Ben stone. So let's continue. Let's try to continue. And here are the obelisks. Obelisks were always erected in pairs, which is very interesting, because if you think of them as light, as beams of light, then that's really a reference to subtle energy, right? And when we realize that the two of them are put together on either side of the entrance to the temple, and that the initiates, right, the enlightened ones, walk through the middle between them, you get a reference to the yogic symbol of the Ida and Pingale and the energies that rise up the spine. So there's an analogy there. And this is the entrance, I think, to Luxor. But they still have one. There used to be one over here, which is now probably in some European city or other. Right, so there's the analogy. Okay, so there already is a metaphysical idea about the origins of the universe, manifest as an architectonic form, right? And a layout as well, because there's a symmetry here, and you go through the side of the thing. Okay. So we take it one step further. Here's the shot of the bird the phoenix is now sitting on that pyramidion, right? And that's how, and then the shaft is now holding the offering. But here are two symbols. This is the sun. This is called the sun on its horizon, right? This thing, and then it's replaced at a later time by the actual pyramid shape. So when the pyramid, the whole idea of the pyramid is that it is the origin point of the light that radiates then down onto the earth. Okay, so this is the origin of that symbol. Now to go back to Atum, he's still around, Atum, and at the first stage, there's only him. There's just one being, and he projects out from himself two other beings called Shu and Tefnut, which are I think the moist and the dry, or the wet and the dry potentials, and they're a male and female. Now, how he actually does this is quite interesting for our time. There was actually three metaphors. I've only listed two of them here, but there were three metaphors. In one case, he spits them out. He expectorates them, right? And in another one, he sneezes. Another one of the gnomes had him sneezing, right? And in another story, he masturbates, right? Now, this is an interesting illustration for us, because it kind of shows how far we've fallen in a certain way. Masturbation is a subject that you can't raise in the public realm in the United States. Even to this day, there was a woman in the Clinton administration. I don't know if anybody remembers this story. There was a woman named Dr. Elders, right? Jocelyn Elders, who she was a Surgeon General. Right?
Yeah.
She was a doctor, you know, and a rational person. What can you say? She was like not insane, as the Feinstein theory says, you know. And that's too much for the government. You can't be not insane and be in the government. So she gave a speech one time in which she suggested that if you're worried about premarital sex by young people, that maybe if they masturbated, there wouldn't be so much premarital sex. Well, she was fired the next day. That was it. One word in a sentence, you're out. Goodbye. Cannot be discussed in the public agenda, or I think anywhere in the West. It's not just the United States. So this really shows how far we've fallen, how we've I don't want to make the metaphor too gross, but we've cut off parts of ourselves Like we're literally psychotic. I mean, if a person cuts off their fingers or they open themselves up to let the evil out, they're psychotic, and we put them in hospitals and stuff. But we've done that with ourselves, and this is something I think that you were getting at in the talk, you know, in your talk, in your own way. So this is an interesting reference between then and now. But anyway, Shu and Tefnut come out, and they are dispatched from Atum, and they disappear into the waters of the Nun, right? And so Atum wants to find them. He needs to find them, and so he sends he sends out his eye to find them. So the eye begins to represent the idea of the extension of knowledge or consciousness, right? But the eye is also an organ of light. So light gets merged, the idea of the emergence of light gets fused with this idea of the eye and with the pyramid, right? So you get this very seminal symbol that we're all familiar with. It's in everybody's pocket right now, and associated with Franklin Roosevelt. Actually, this side of the seal disappeared for like 150 years after they created it, and it was dug out by somebody in the Roosevelt administration. I'm not sure exactly who dug it out. Probably some Freemason dug it out. Yeah. And well, he was a Mason too himself, I think, Franklin Roosevelt. But there it is. You see, so the eye is the consciousness of the divine. It's the and you have to understand also that in the ancient time and into the Middle Ages, it was felt that light came out of the person, right? That the human being was the source of the light, and the way you saw something is that the light projected out and bounced off and came back. And interestingly enough, the geometries are identical, whether you assume that the light is outside or inside. Okay, you couldn't tell just by the geometry alone. So nobody could figure it out for many years. And in point of fact, it's kind of an assumption on our part. Right? Most of modern science is assumption, by the way. I don't want to belabor that one. But the eye, and interestingly, the eye is also this thing called the Wajid eye, is a means of numerical notation, because every part of the symbol is a fraction. Right? Now, Egyptians generally wrote fractions with 1 as the numerator. Right, because it was focused on unity partly, but partly because they didn't have the means to express these things in other ways, and they had very cumbersome methods of addition and subtraction, multiplication, division. I won't go into them in this presentation, but you could do a whole course just on how to look at things from Egyptian mathematics. It actually would be very enlightening to do that, because it will change your thought process about what you're seeing and what you're doing, and about the logic of things, right? So. Okay, so I think I've exhausted this one. So the eye becomes an important symbol, and we see it here associated with the pyramid. Right? Okay, so there's the eye. Now, when the eye returns, the eye finds Shu and Tefnut and brings them back. But Atum, in the meantime, has replaced the eye with another eye. This is Egyptian mythology, so I'm not making this up, right? I'm getting this from you. One asked me, what is it, Johnny Carson used to say, I only tell the jokes, I don't explain them. And the audience wouldn't laugh. He would say, I only tell the jokes, I don't explain them. Right? So that's my position here, too. So the eye becomes enraged when it realizes it's been replaced. And it metamorphosizes into a rearing cobra. Now, remember that Atum was a serpentine potential. So every part of him could become serpentine. So the eye becomes serpentine. And in order to appease it, in order to keep peace in the family, basically, he turns the cobra into a crown called the uraeus, right? And he wraps the cobra around his head, and the head of the serpent with its hood, the head of the cobra with its hood, projects out, and you see it here on the right. You can see it pretty clearly here. You can see it here, and these squares are interesting. We'll get to the canon of 19. This is 18 19ths to the human height. And this is 19 19ths, and the final increment goes from the third eye to the crown, from the brow chakra to the crown chakra. Right? And here's an actual uraeus that somebody wore, and they dug out of a tomb. And here's another representation. I'm not sure exactly what this is, but it's a representation of the rearing serpent. And so this is, I'm quoting from this man, Rundle Clark. RC is Rundle Clark. And he equates these symbols all together. And it's interesting, the tears from the eye in its rage fall to the edge of this bubble. and they become worms. Now, this is interesting because you talked about worms, right? They become worms, which after many ages develop into all the living things of the world. And in fact, there was a modern scholar, I think named Ginsberg, who wrote a book called The Cheese and the Worms, right? About cosmology and the in Italy and when they called it when the church rounded up people, I forget what they call it. The Inquisition, right? It's about the Inquisition. Because this guy was espousing that life came from worms, and so the Inquisition arrested him.
That's right.
So, and that's how he found it, because a record, because the Inquisition kept a record, right? And this guy, he was just a guy, he was a drunk in a bar, you know? And they arrested him because he was talking about cosmology at the bar, right? So you see, hey, Jonas, take notice, man. You think we want to talk about cosmology, watch out. The CIA, you know, is listening now with the NSA, whatever they are, right? There's still, the Inquisition is still out there listening, so be careful. Now, I apologize for the, for all the verbiage here on this one, but this is kind of an important concept, the ka. Right, now one of the aspects of the Egyptian soul was this thing called the ka. The ka is a non-physical vitalizing principle. It's a force that flows and is very much like chi or prana, right? And it can be attracted and repelled, right? So to attract the ka, you need a physical container. It has no physical form of its own, and it seeks to wrap itself around physical forms. And it is what keeps the body alive. And it's the basis of the idea of mummification in Egypt, because the ka had to be kept with the body so that this other aspect of the soul called the ba, which I won't go into, it's kind of the identity or the ego aspect, more the ego consciousness, or it could be called the anima, that which moves us, and not the Jungian anima necessarily. But the ba goes up and back between the eternal realm and the physical realm. The Kat is the physical body, so the Ka stays with the physical body, the Ba goes up and back. But in order for this thing called the Ak, which is the permanent immortal being, so to speak, to exist, these two guys have to get together, the Ka and the Ba. And so in order for the Ka to remain in place, you had to preserve the body. And you could also attract the Ka by sheer physical density, right? So the motivation for working in stone, which the Egyptians made a big breakthrough on architecturally, right? Because when they did the early stuff, it was all mud brick, right? And if you go to Mesopotamia, it's all mud brick. And it didn't last, unfortunately. That's why we know much less about Mesopotamia than we know about Egypt. But the Egyptians, because of this idea of the Ka, began to work in stone, right? So the stone would attract the Ka, and there was always a statue of the king that would also serve as a container for the Ka. And this is, I'm quoting this man Gideon down at the bottom, Siegfried Gideon, was an early 20th century historian. His book is called The Eternal Present, The Beginning of Architecture, about Egyptian and Mesopotamian architecture. And he argues very strongly, he says, the beginning of stone architecture is inseparably bound up with the Ka, because only stone could provide an indestructible container for the Ka. So this was the motivation for them, first for mummification, and then later for working in stone. Right? And here's the descent. This is called the Aeneid. There are 9 divinities. Atum gives rise to Shu and Tefnut. Shu and Tefnut gives rise to Geb and Nut, the earth and the sky. So you've got, basically you've got the 4 elements in here somewhere. I'm not exactly sure how to divide them up, but you've got I'm not sure who fire represents in here, but I think it's Nut, because she's up in the sky, so she's the fire. Geb is the earth. And Shu is probably the air, and Tefnut is water, right, or the liquid potential. So, and then Nut and Geb give rise to 2 sets of twins, Isis and Osiris, and Set and Nephthys. And this is from John Anthony West, this slide, and he's arranged them in a tetractys, right, in this form of the tetractys, and he's got 9, there are 9 gods, and he puts the eye in the center. I would have put the circle in the center, right, the original symbol of the circle. So that's the descent. Now, in Isis, I can't tell the whole story, obviously, of Isis and Osiris. It's a huge mythic cycle, and we could go on and on. It's a wonderful story. But the trick, I'm only going to focus on the architectonic aspects of it, right? So, so Osiris has his evil twin brother Set, and Set tricks him, and what he does is he measures Osiris. Now this is interesting. The first step in his evil deed is to measure Osiris. Now this is interesting because you know there's a scene in the Old Testament where all of the creatures are paraded before Adam, and the divinity asks him to name them. He tells him to name all the creatures, and then at the end he says, well, now that you know the secret names of all these creatures, you have power over them. Right? You have the power over them. Right? You're in charge of them. And the same thing is true in design, really.